aviation safety inspector for the NTSB. That's a pretty big recognition. He's been involved in numerous investigations. Obviously the National 747 over in Bagram, most recently the balloon accident down in Texas. So it's not just one type of aircraft or type of incident that they're involved in. It's a wide range variety. Some of the other accidents he's been involved in: Air India, the Omega Air refueler, the 707 out in Point Mugu, the U.S. Airways, recently the UPS A300 down in Birmingham, Alabama. So I was able to meet him in Huntsville with one of our FAA Loadmaster Working Group meetings back in November of last year, and he presented to us the same presentation he's going to have today on the national accident. I learned a lot from it. I've been around aviation for a while and found it very interesting. Reached out to Captain Lawrence a couple weeks ago to see if he would take some time out of his busy schedule, if he could come out to the PLA, the gathering of the loads here, and share the same briefing and information. He was one of the lead investigators for the operations side for the Bagram incident. So he has a lot of first-hand experience. So let me introduce Captain David Lawrence from the NTSB.
Haven't done anything yet. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Doug. And thanks for all of what you guys do. Obviously, as you know, there's been a lot on the civilian side of activity with cargo loading, commercial loading, special loads, and particularly the loadmaster position. And most of that, the genesis of all those changes that are going on right now is because of this accident. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Typically, I've done this presentation about a dozen times to various groups, some in the military, some civilian. But what I did is tailored this a little bit more. Usually my briefings are at the 30,000 foot level. They're general. We talk about the accident, but based on this crowd, I'm going to take it down to the 5,000 foot level. We're going to get into the weeds on some of the stuff. So I'm going to put you at the accident site and let you see what we saw and how we developed our process all the way through the investigation and got to the final report. And we'll talk about some of those issues as we go. One of the things I pulled up this morning I thought was real interesting, especially since the nice weather we have. Anybody familiar with Embry-Riddle down at Daytona Beach, the Flight Academy? I just pulled this up this morning, and somebody knows something. I think that's all individual aircraft that they're getting out of Embry-Riddle, so I'm really happy that we're in this nice weather here. So let's talk about the accident flight. Let me give you a brief overview of it. Happened back in 2013. It was a Boeing 747-400 BCF. That stands for Boeing Converted Freighter. It used to be a passenger airplane. The seat tracks had all those seats on the main deck were still there. And then they put in a TELR system for the rollers and rails that they could load ULVs and containers and secure on the deck. So this was originally a passenger airplane that was converted into a freighter. It was operated by National Air Cargo. They were doing business as National Airlines. It was part of the ISAF group that was pulling out material for the military out of Afghanistan. Its call sign was actually ISAF Flight 95 Alpha Quebec. Multi-motor contract with Transcom. I actually had a lieutenant colonel that was shadowing me during the entire investigation. He was a liaison with AMC. And the total cargo weight on this aircraft, we're going to get into details on this, was about a little over 94,000 kilograms, and if I do my math right, it's about 207,500 pounds. That's what this airplane was carrying. Out of Bagram, 7 crew members, 2 captains, 2 first officers, 2 mechanics, and 1 loadmaster. And they were all fatally injured. The responding group, once we got notification of the accident, you have to understand too that when this accident happened, it happened overseas, it happened in a foreign territory. So actually at the very beginning, Afghanistan government owned this investigation. By treaty, which is called Annex 13, they own the investigation. So what we did is we actually launched to assist the Afghanistan government. It wasn't until about a year and a half later that the Afghanistan government found out that they had absolutely no business being civilian accident investigation business, and they delegated it to us. Now, once they did that, it became our investigation, and that's why we went through the whole investigation, had a board meeting and everything. So there are 4 of us from the NTSB, 1 from the FAA, 1 from Boeing. Operator National Airlines had 4 people, and of course the military, the lieutenant colonel that was tagging along with me during the investigation. The problem is, it's Afghanistan, and it's hard to get there. We actually launched from Washington, D.C. to Istanbul to Kabul, and then we took this, which was my bucket list item, over from Kabul over to Bagram. And it was my bucket list item, and I was having a good time when we were heading over to Bagram. And I was thinking, this is really great until I saw those going on. And I realized I wasn't in Kansas anymore. This was going to be a little bit more unique. My Marriott points upgraded me to a wonderful hotel room and the bunker. First accident I've ever done that I had a helmet Kevlar while we were at accident site. Anybody been in Bagram? Everybody has. Okay. In the center of the airfield, over there where all the aircraft are, on the opposite side of the air traffic controller, there is a old Russian control tower. Y'all know where that is? Yep. These are the steps leading down from that, and our command center was down in the basement of that. And we couldn't get the investigator in charge, who was in Afghani for a while until they delegated. We couldn't get him to come down here because apparently, and I don't know if this is true, but we were told this is where the Russians used to do the tortures for the Afghanis when the Russians were there. And he said, I won't go down there. So we did all our work in this command center. Let's talk about the accident plane for a second. What it originally did. It started out of Châteauroux, France, and it flew down to Camp Bastion, empty. The same crew that was involved in the accident. Once they got to Camp Bastion, they loaded up their cargo, but they couldn't get overflight permits from Camp Bastion over Pakistan, so they flew up to Bagram and simply refueled. And that then took off for Bagram. They were going to head down to Dubai and offload. And that's when the accident happened. Once they landed in Bagram, the airplane on the landing experienced a overheated braking because they had to get on the brakes to stop. Now this is better than 11,000 foot runway in the 747, so there's a hint. It required about an hour cooling time for the brakes to cool, so they sat there, refueled, and allowed the brakes to cool. While they were there, we were able to extract the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder. We did have a cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder for a time, so we listened to it. And during that time that they were sitting on the ground, there were several comments that they made to the loadmasters, the pilots did. They had talked about the load moving a couple of inches. The straps that were holding the airplane or the load forward were all very taut, and the straps that were holding the load from going aft were very loose. So the loadmaster had gone down and told the captain to go down there and cinch those down. Okay, and they had also brought up a broken strap, and had mentioned that there had been a knot on the strap. Anybody have any experience with strapping? I mean, most of you guys change this stuff. Okay. Hint, right? These guys had an understanding early on that something had happened to the load while they were there. And the loadmaster went down there and they cinched it down. Okay, the accident takeoff, they were cleared for takeoff. And on the CVR, we heard the captain, the co-pilot was the flying pilot, we heard the captain say, or the co-pilot said, gear up, and the captain said, gear up. And he raised the gear. And as soon as he raised the gear, the CVR stopped. And that's all the data we had. So did the flight data recorder. So we had everything on data. All the recorders went right up to that rotation point, and when they called for gear up, everything stopped. About 30 seconds later is when the aircraft crashed. Now, everybody has seen the dashboard camera video. Okay? It obviously shows that the airplane was in a steep climb. We'll show you in a second. It had a peak altitude, then it rolled off to the right, and you'll see this in a second, rapid descent. And it actually came back wings level and impacted almost wings level. didn't go all the way through the sequence because this is the actual portion of the video that we showed in the board meeting, so no sense in going through it. Let me show you a couple of stills. First off, when we were on our way to Afghanistan, we got a lot of messages. Everybody and their brother, every time, once we got to Istanbul, once we got to Kabul, everybody's sending us texts with, "Have you seen this? Have you seen this? Have you seen this?" Yes, we've seen it. Everybody was sending us the YouTube videos of this, and we were watching it. So we had seen it, okay? But then we started looking at it a little bit closer, and this was before we even got to Bagram, the accident site. And I noticed something on this that was a little unusual. Can you see it?
Yeah, gears down.
Okay, gears down. Should it be down?
No.
Maybe. No. Is all the gear down? Tell you what, let's come back. We noticed something unusual on this, and that piqued our interest. So we'll come back. Bagram Airfield is one runway. It's almost 12,000 feet. This is what it looks like from the air on the chart. This is toward the end of the runway. And when we first got there, the sweepers had swept because they always sweep after a heavy departure. But they had found some debris that they picked up right about the Charlie intersection. Anybody taking off, you know where Charlie is. It's right about where the air traffic control tower is. And you can see here that the parts were down here toward the Charlie intersection. We also found some parts down here, and the main wreckage was located in that red box. So we started taking a look at some of those parts. And one of them was this little antenna on the left. And this was the aft military vehicle. We're going to get into the load of detail in a second, but this is the aft military vehicle, and it was missing its antenna. And we found that antenna over by the Charlie intersection on the runway. It's missing there. That's a clue. Another thing, we had the security cam video everybody saw on YouTube, but we also had a few security camera videos from inside the base. And here was my senior moment when I was in Bagram. I asked Lieutenant Colonel that was head of security, I said, why do you, I think we only had 3 security cameras that captured the accident sequence. And he said, why only 3? We're here on a base. Why do you only have 3 cameras? He said, well, we don't typically point the cameras in a war zone. We're usually pointing them out. And I said, okay, duh. But we did get 1 security camera, and what we did is we superposed the image of the 747 on that right before impact. And what you notice here is the nose gear is down. The main body gear is down. 747 has 3 gear systems. They have the nose gear, they have the main gear, which is out on the wings, but they also, because of the weight, they have this body gear, this big truck underneath the fuselage. That's what we saw there. We saw the truck, we saw the nose gear. What wasn't there, and this is just a superposed image, the main landing gear was not there. Okay, that's a clue. Something's going on there. So what we looked at is the hydraulic systems. What we found out on the taxiway was this little bent piece of hydraulic line that was part of the number 2 hydraulic system that was out on the runway. This is the aft end of the 747 looking back toward the aft pressure bulkhead. And you see the seat tracks and the flooring right here. The hydraulic lines for a 747 transfer out and exit the main deck area right in this area right here, and they go back to some power control units, PCUs, that help control the elevators, the stabilizer, and all that kind of stuff. And those lines went right here. And that piece was part of the line that went right here. So there's a hydraulic line that was missing. What's interesting is it was the number 2 hydraulic system. And the number 2 hydraulic system was the hydraulic system that powers the nose gear and the main body gear. So what we had was evidence of a breach of the hydraulic system with 3,000 psi spraying out, and the loss of hydraulic system pre-fell the nose gear and the main landing gear. The main gear is up in the well because its hydraulic system was intact. So something breached that. Something knocked out the hydraulic system. So we're still working on this, and we're trying to figure out what happened. But okay, let's take a look at the back of the napkin. I told you this is what it is. We measured the back of the map view, the top portion of this beam right here at the back is 104 inches. Well, if you look at the back of the 747, you see this little rack. This is the aft pressure bulkhead, that cargo door's here. You see this little box here? That's where the avionics rack is. And that's where the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder are located. And that happens to be 104 inches. Exactly. So as we looked at this, we found in the wreckage orange paint transfer right on that bar, right at 104 inches. So now we know what knocked out that CVR and the FDR, right at rotation. So now we're thinking, okay, something happened to this thing to move it back to take out this box and those hydraulic lines down here. So that's where we came up with the cargo shift very early on, right at rotation. So an overview of the accident site itself. Anybody been to Bagram? This is Disney Road, named for Kathy Disney, right? This is Disney Road that circles the entire airfield. And it just so happens, these are these containers that are used by contractors there. And the cockpit ended up right down here, and the fireball actually melted the roof of one of these. And if you watch that YouTube video all the way through, you'll see that truck that was coming down here. He came in this way, and he ends up picking up two guys. If you watch that video all the way through, he'll pick up two guys. Those two guys got out of this container and got out and got in that truck. That's where they were. Very lucky, two very lucky guys. Also, there was a bus stop right there, and at that time of day, it's usually very full, and it just happened nobody was at the bus stop when this thing hit. What was fascinating about this, if you remember in the video, it came down almost wings level, but the energy of the impact was absorbed laterally through the fuselage, that by the time it got to the tail essentially just laid down on the ground. And you can see that there's how that happened, and there was a lot of great information back in the tail. That's where most of the work was done. We were able to extract the CVR and the cockpit voice recorder and the FDR from the tail. Not much left of the cockpit, obviously not much left of the crew, but we had a lot of good information in the back. So that's the horizontal stabilizer that is just sitting on the ground right there. It's actually upside down. So we were able to walk around and do some recovery work there and documentation. Just another view of this is what it's supposed to look like, and this is the aftmost map view that was on board in the back of the airplane. It was pretty well damaged, but there were, like I said, there was a lot of good information that we were able to extract from that. Okay, one of the things we did is we took the aft pressure bulkhead. This is what it's supposed to look like. It's a big covering before the back part of the tail. We took the aft pressure bulkhead and we reconstructed it. It was broken up in about 6 different pieces, and we put it together. And we noticed this huge tire mark on the aft pressure bulkhead, which corresponded to where this donut black circle is. And if you measure that donut and where this was located, the impact, it fits exactly where the spare tire is. So now we have more evidence that this unit went back through the aft pressure bulkhead. In fact, here's another view of just the floor. I told you it was a Boeing converted freighter. A lot of the seat tracks are down here, but they also had a supplemental type certificate system from Tel-Air for the rollers, and you can see the uplocks. We actually did find the aft pallet that this vehicle was sitting on, and it was kind of folded up underneath, but on the underside of that, we actually found red markings for the uplocks right in series on there. So now we know that pallet went over those uplocks, and as it was going toward the back. The other thing that I'll point out about this is that this little area, it's kind of a little back area as the tail of the airplane kind of comes in. This is only rated by Boeing for 5,000 pounds floor load. That's it. And that unit that was back there was 12 tons. So whatever's going back here is taking this floor out. Remember, those hydraulic lines were right here. And just another close-up of the impression. It was the impression of that tire on the aft pressure bulkhead was so good we could read the initial tire pressure on the this impression on the bulkhead. So what's behind the bulkhead? Well, behind the bulkhead, which is this green, if you were to look back there, is this big contraption. It's called a jack screw assembly. It's the big mechanical device that moves the horizontal stabilizer. It's a big mechanical device. It's hydraulically powered, but it moves that. So what we looked at, and this is what it's supposed to look like right here, jack screw assembly. When we got on scene and started looking at that, we saw it has been knocked out by no less than a 5-degree attitude, and there were impact marks on that jack screw assembly. So now we have the evidence that something happened to the hydraulic systems. It got severed. Something happened to that aft pressure bulkhead. We have the tire impression on it, and now we have impression marks on that jack screw assembly. We don't know what it means yet, but we know something went back in and hit that jack screw assembly. So what we did is we did a computer simulation and a performance study. We had evidence that the rear mapping moved back. We did the simulation based on what available FER data we had and the aerodynamic modeling that Boeing has. And we tried to match, if we could match what this attitude of the airplane did, match what the physical evidence that was on the ground. Okay? So we said, all right, what would happen if you had lost both number 1 and number 2 hydraulic system? And remember, the elevator system on this airplane controls the pitch. Once you sever those 2 hydraulic lines in the floor, you lose half your pitch capability. So when the pilot does this, he only has half the pitch capability on his control column. Okay? What would happen if 4 or 5 of the vehicles came back? Not just the one, but all of them came back. Well, we have no direct evidence of that, so let's stick with the one that did come loose. And we found out that it would be uncontrollable. That horizontal stabilizer would be uncontrollable if you lost 2 hydraulic systems and one of those mappings went back and hit that jack screw assembly. And that's where we came up with the probable cause that this one vehicle went back. It could have been more vehicles, but we didn't have the evidence. We had the evidence that one, and based on the hydraulic loss and the impact marks, we know that one went all the way back into the tail. Probably, obviously punctured the fuselage because we found debris on the runway. Okay? A lot of people asked us about this. First off, at this high pitch attitude in the video, everybody says they were doing a tactical departure. It's a civilian operation. They don't do tactical departures. It's not in their procedures. So this high pitch attitude was not the pilots trying to get away from any kind of ground flight. It was the loss of control of the airplane. And a lot of people were asking if we did any type of combat assessment on the debris. And we did. JCAB, which is the Joint Combat Assessment Team, went out and did a lot of analysis on different parts, and we found no bomb residue. There was no IDF. There was nothing going on in Bagram that day. Anybody been there? Well, who was there that day? I know we have a couple of people, yeah. It was windy, but there wasn't anything going on, right? All right, let's talk about the cargo build. The guys that built this up in Camp Bastion were actually vendors for National Airlines. They're kind of under the umbrella of National Holding, but it was called National Air Cargo, or NAC. And they were the ground loaders that loaded this load in Camp Bastion. What we found is, because I asked them, do you have any special instructions on how to do this? And they didn't. Nor were any special instructions provided to the loadmaster. The Cougars, you should see in a second, were placed on a double pallet, and the loaders in Camp Bastion didn't even have a Boeing manual in their base or a computer just to look at stuff online. They had no way of knowing or referencing any kind of manual on how to do it. So these were the loads. They had 3 of the 12-ton MAPVs that were in the front and the back, and in the middle were 2 of the MAPVs, sorry, and in the middle load were 3 of these big bad boys, these 18-ton Cougars. All right. These pictures were taken in Bagram because I interviewed the loader several times, the guy that was in charge of loading and helping and going by the instructions of the loadmaster. The loadmaster was the one that said, I want you to load it this way, load it this way, load it this way. It's good. How Copy that, let's do it. So I interviewed that load supervisor in Camp Bastion several times, and I just couldn't get a mental picture on how he did this. And so I told him and his entire crew that touched this airplane, Camp Bastion, to fly up the next day. I got a Cougar and a MAPD, and I said, show me how you did it. Show me what you did, okay? And what they did is they put the MAPD, 12 units on a single pallet, chained it to the pallet and shored it in the center unit. Let the air out of the tires and let it ride on the shoring. They did the same thing with the Cougar, however, they did a double pallet system. They put two pallets together. These are G-load pallets. Put them together, put some plywood in between, and strapped them together. And then chained it to the pallet. And I asked them, where'd you get the idea to do this? He said, somebody just told me that was kind of the way to do it. It was a tribal knowledge thing. There was absolutely no guidance on how to do this. And keep those pallets from doing this during loading. So they chained it. You see the single pallet and the double pallet for the Cougar. So I'm thinking something's not right about this. Then I asked him for his phone, the cargo supervisor. And I looked through his phone. And sure enough, this was such an unusual load for these guys, they took pictures of them loading. This is the actual loading of that accident load when they were in Camp Bastion. So we were able to verify where the chains were. You can see the double pallet system on this Cougar that's getting loaded. We can see where they had loaded everything. You can almost see the plywood in between. These are the guys that what they did is they put them onto the main deck, rolled them up, and put them 5 feet or 5 right in a line, and they put them about 3 inches apart. The pallets were about 3 inches. So right now there's no uplocks because these pallets are covering the uplocks. So this was a free-floating load that was on the center of the 747. And you can also see just how much clearance there was not. It was a huge load. So what they called this was a special load. And it's special because it was non-standard. It was an odd-sized load. There was no way to put ULD or unit load devices, those big containers. You couldn't lock this load onto the airplane's floor. It was impossible. Okay? So they were free-floating around. The only way to secure this load onto that main deck was to take straps, strap it down. So this is what a typical ULD looks like. This is nothing that you guys don't already know. You can see how the locking mechanism holds it onto the main deck door. This is right there. This is just kind of a sample of strapping on a free floating load, and you can see that they put straps all over to try and secure this load. So, what are some of the limitations that you as a load master have when you're having this type of load come out? Well, first thing in the civilian world is the type certificate holder has a manual and guidance. Boeing has a manual guidance that says this is what you can do and how you can do it, and this is where you can put this load. The cargo handling system, the big roller system and the side rails on the floor, all were made by Tel-Air, and they were installed, and they have limitations. Okay? I'm going to go back to Boeing a second. Remember, this is a converted freighter, so all that floor is nothing but seat tracks for the most part, right? And 95% of the straps on this load were attached to seat tracks. They didn't consider that Boeing said some of those seat tracks aren't rated for strapping at all. You can't put any kind of strap on. They didn't consider that. It wasn't in their manual, so I'll get to that in a second. But for limitations, first off, a loadmaster would have to understand all of this information. He would have to have it available to him. Others are the location of the cargo in the airplane for center of gravity. By the way, in the performance study, we actually did a performance study. If they hadn't lost the hydraulic system and hadn't lost this jack screw assembly, if it hadn't been impacted, And all 5 of these vehicles went all the way back to the tail of the airplane. That airplane would still have been controlled. The pilot would have had enough control authority. It was the combination of loss of hydraulics and the impact on the Jackson assembly that made it uncontrollable. Floor structural limitations. Just because the floor looks all the same on the 747, there are certain areas that have different structural load limitations. Allowable strap loads. They used canvas straps, a whole ton of them, that were 5,000-pound rated straps. What they didn't do, well, one of the considerations for a strap angle is, as you angle a strap, as you guys probably know, as you angle it, you lose some of its load-bearing characteristics, okay? As you go up 90 degrees, you got 0, and as you go all the way down, you'll have 5,000 pounds. So as you come up at angles, you're going to lose the capability of that strap. So that's a limitation. The number of straps is a limitation. Just the geography on the main deck, where you can put these straps. There's not a lot of room. And then your strap attachment locations on the actual vehicle itself. You have, each one of these vehicles had specs where you can attach straps to and strap it down. You guys reference that when you're doing our 130s and stuff too, right? So, yeah, these guys look at us like, I didn't know there were specs on these vehicles. I kid you not. All right, documentation also. Weight and balance manual and loading control documents. These are civilian terms. I think you guys have some alternative terms in the military on how this is done. But the weight and balance manual is something that has a lot of information in it. It's produced by the type certificate holder, Boeing. These are FAA approved documents. In other words, the FAA has looked at this and they have verified the accuracy of that information and said good to go. And the weight and balance manuals from the type certificate holder has technical details, safety critical information. This is really stuff you have to have, especially as a loadmaster, to understand how to secure this load on this particular airplane. Let's talk about what National Airlines had. They had a weight and balance manual, and it was approved by the FAA. Okay, they said that's good. They also had a cargo operations manual, and it was accepted by the FAA. There's a big difference in civilian terminology between an approved manual and accepted. Approved means that data is good, the information has been reviewed, it's technically and engineering standpoint sound. An accepted manual means, yeah, you got a manual. Cool. That's it. The technical aspects of this manual were never reviewed. Okay? It was reviewed and approved, but it was never verified that it was accurate. And we found that the guidance in this manual, which is what the loadmaster was using to do this load, we found that guidance was wrong. The chief loadmaster, who was responsible for building this manual, had basically taken a bunch of manuals from other operators and cut and pasted a bunch of stuff together. But what he forgot to do is put Boeing certified data and FAA approved data in that manual. So this loadmaster was set up, so to speak, because he had nothing in his manuals that would accurately tell him how to secure this load. Had numerous areas, and a lot of the safety critical information from Boeing was completely missing. And this is the manual the loadmaster relied on to secure this load, and was wrong. And by the way, it's what he was trained on. So what we find, if you look at the report, we find that had the loadmaster he did a lot of things wrong as far as how he secured the load, but had he even followed the manual to the letter, this load was not going to stay on the aircraft because the guidance was that bad. Here are some of what National Airlines considered. They considered that all strap angles would only go to a maximum of 30 degrees. Now you guys use chains. Is every chain at a maximum of 30 degrees? It's impossible. Okay? They're going to change. But their assumption was that everything was going to be a maximum of 30 degrees. What they did do is they said, well, what we'll do is we're just going to take 75%, we're going to take 25% off that 5,000 pound strap capability for safety purposes. And we're gonna say that strap's only capable of 3,750 pounds weight. But their problem was, they made equal capability of that, and they said that that strap, now that 3,750 pound limit on that strap, it could react in any direction, laterally, vertically, and forward out, depending on what's in the front or the back. They said that strap can do anything at any one time. So when I put that down, I got a credit of 3,750 pounds for that strap, no matter what. Anything wrong with that?
Yeah.
What? What?
That's, you got the angles for vertical and lateral isn't taken into account.
Exactly.
You got 3 different limits.
Yeah, you have 3 different limits, not one limit that accounts for all 3. That's what they did. How they figured this load is they took the 12 tons for like the MAPV, they took that 12 tons and divided it by 3,750 pounds for straps, and that's how they determined how many straps to put on it.
That's a planning. You gotta measure what you got.
Lack thereof, right? They also assumed that there were an infinite number of tie-down points on each one of these vehicles. Is that true? How many of these tie-down points are per your specs do these vehicles typically have? Typically 5, 6, some have maybe 7 or 9 tie-down point, but they said that you can tie this down anywhere on the vehicle and strap it down. Okay? The other thing they didn't consider was the tall, rigid cargo requirement. So, tall, rigid cargo. 747, if you look at the main deck, you walk on there and you look up toward the nose cone and you look up toward the front, you see that the ceiling comes down some. Right? You know why? It's where the cockpit is. All right? The cockpit and the supernumerary that sits behind it all rest low. Okay? So when you put a load in a 747, you got to make sure that it's secure enough that if it's too tall, it doesn't go wiping out the cockpit in a deceleration like a rejected takeoff or something like that. So you have a 96-inch limit for that right there. These were 104 inches. So what they needed was what's called frangible cargo, a bunch of crunchable stuff up in the nose to prevent it. And they also wanted to limit this load to 9 Gs. Because by FAA standards in the civilian world, they assumed that deceleration would not exceed 9 Gs during a rejected takeoff or a runway excursion. So they had to make sure this load was able to withstand a 9 G limitation, or 9 G deceleration. Okay? That wasn't done. The tall, rigid cargo, there was no frangible cargo up in the front. If this load had gone straight through, it would have taken out the cockpit. If it was a rejected takeoff, it had all come loose, and the cockpit would have just come flying out in front of the airplane. These weren't considered, and all of that is contrary to FAA regulations. They never even took it into account. So the load looked like this. Okay? Your 3 Cougars, a MAPV, and a NAPV. And this is the aft pressure bulkhead back here. The load was here. According to that load supervisor, he had about 3 inches of space between each one of those pallets. So the question we had, what question would you ask when you see this?
What are you showing?
Where are you going to put the straps? The heck with 9G, where are you going to put a strap in the first place? Okay? Where do you have the physical geography to actually strap this thing down? And what they had, remember they had rails here that had been installed, but all this floor here had those seat tracks. So they put the straps down on the seat tracks here. However, there was nothing in the front and nothing in the back, so there was nothing securing the lateral load on this load at all. You can do angles, you can strap at angles, but what happens when you start angling straps? You lose the reactive capability of that strap. So what we did is when we were at the accident site, we asked the chief load master, the one that was involved in He was responsible for training this guy. He was responsible for developing the training program. He was the one that did the cut and paste on all their manuals and put them together. So I said, okay, you're the expert. You should know. Here's how much this load weighs. Tell me how many straps. Well, the accident load had 24 straps per mat beam, 12-ton unit, and 26 straps per 18-ton cougar. That's what the accident load it was. So I asked the chief loadmaster, how many should he have had? He said, well, based on our guidance, he did the math. He said he should have had 32 for the mat beam, 32 straps to hold it down, and 44, and he later came back and said, well, the cougar's a little heavier than that, so 46. 46 straps we should have had, all right? Then we went into the manufacturer, Boeing. Said, okay, this is what this operator says you need to secure load for each of the 5 units that are on there. Boeing came back and said, for one mat beam, you needed 60 straps, and based on the loading of the floor, that was the only vehicle you could put on. One. Just one. And it needed 60 straps. We asked the railing company, Teller, because they, have their STC on the aircraft, and said, how many would you do based on their interpretation of tall, rigid cargo as an old interpretation? They said, you should not have put any of these vehicles on this airplane at all. None. Boeing, the builder of the airplane, said, best you could do is put one, not 5. So we wanted to know, what would 60 straps look like? And that's the artist's rendition of what 60 straps should have looked like to secure one vehicle. Remember how they were all 3 inches apart? Was there enough geography to put this load on this airplane? None. By the way, we did, on the straps, we did pull a lot of straps out. We saw fraying on the straps, which signified overstressing and overloading. I told you about the little markings underneath the pallet and things like that. There were some angle marks or angle cuts on some of the straps. So they had been cut as they were going through the back end of the airplane. But a lot of the straps had fraying showing an overloading on these. And there was the company actually had no quality control on their strap inspection program to make sure these straps were good. So it may be a 5,000 pound strap. It may not be a 5,000. It may have been old quality. These are just some pictures of other operators. This is not the accident load, but how they typically would strap these things. Keep in mind, this is a free floating pallet. This is not locked to a thing on the floor. This is how it's secured. With straps. And this, keep in mind also, this is not the only operator out there doing this. This is not unique. So we looked at the loadmaster. We wanted to ask what the loadmaster's role was. So for the company, they told me the loadmaster is responsible for ensuring that the cargo is secure. Got it. Right? He's also typically in the civilian industry, the loadmaster will go with the airplane because they'll fly to areas that may not have a ground crew there to assist. So the loadmaster mechanics will fly with the airplane and usually scheduled with the crew. The main thing, and this is not just in the civilian world, but it's also something in the military world too, coming as an airline pilot, they rely exclusively on this guy to do the job right. One of the unique aspects in the civilian world is that there is only one certified position responsible for that airplane and that cargo load, and that's the pilot, captain. He's the only one that's got a certificate. Everybody else under him doesn't. So the final certificated authority for this cargo load is the captain. And guess how much training he gets on cargo loads? 0. That's why. So we wanted to look at special cargo loads. In this particular one, and we found out that National Airlines had ever even tried to do an 18-ton Cougar before. Never. So we asked him, did you do a risk analysis? Did you get any special instructions? Did you contact the military to find out their specs on this and what they would suggest on how to secure this? Nothing. When I asked the chief loadmaster, why didn't you do a risk analysis? Why didn't you go through and provide something to the loadmaster as a tool? He said, that's not my job. Our job is you call, we haul. Now it's scary. Accident first officer and the loadmaster at the time had absolutely they had never seen one of these loads before. So when that loadmaster was telling that load supervisor in Camp Bastion, okay, put 24 on those mappies, put 26 straps on that Cougar, he had no experience. None. On any of that kind of load. And as we know, the loadmaster, even if he had used his manual, it would have been wrong anyways. The manual was wrong. So we kind of want to get our heads wrapped around the loadmaster position in the civilian world. And let me just give you the very clip notes on this. It doesn't exist. Agree with that?
Yeah.
Nowhere in any FAA regulations, save for SAFO 13005, nowhere in any FAA documentation does it say anything about a loadmaster in the civilian world. So, for all practical purposes, there is no such thing as a loadmaster in the civilian world. Load supervisors, they happen to travel with the airplane, but everybody, they still use the term, but it's not a certificated position. As such, it's not subject to any oversight. Any FAA oversight, review of quality training, procedures, background experience, none. Doesn't exist. In the military, you guys can tell me that's completely different, right? It's considered different. There's stringent training, there's certain requirements. You're considered a required crew member. That's not the case in the civilian world. It's not certified, and in the one piece of literature the FAA put out said, hey, when you do these kind of special loads, free-floating loads and stuff, you really should get a qualified loadmaster. Now, it's the only time they ever mentioned it, but I asked them the question, you just put that in one of your documents. Tell me what a qualified loadmaster is. The FAA can't have an answer because they don't have any definition of a loadmaster in the civilian world. That's really weird saying in a group of professional loadmasters. But for all practical purposes, the position doesn't exist in the civilian. So we want to take a look at what type of training this loadmaster got, right? And for his initial training, by the way, his background, and this was, we interviewed a lot of people about his background. He was a good kid. He was like 31 years old. Great kid. Really diligent. He studied hard. He just wanted to get ahead. He was a ground supervisor of some box company or something like that before he got in with National. So he had absolutely no engineering background, no loadmaster background. So he starts out from ground zero for all practical purposes when he starts his training. And this is his training. It was 68 hours total. Included dangerous goods for 24 hours, some policy information, cargo, how to fill out cargo docs, ground security coordinator, so security stuff, some ground ops work as far as how the airplane works on the RF. They had 12 hours about the airplane systems and that tail-air system, the tie-down system, crew resource management, human resources. Doesn't all add up to 68 hours, but there's some administration stuff that was also included in that. My question is, what's not on here?
Cargo shutdown.
The loadmaster job.
How to do the job. The training didn't teach him how to do the job. Taught him how to fill out paperwork. What a 747, you recognize that 3 out of 4 times when he walks on a ramp. CRM, ground ops, security stuff, nothing. His training had nothing to do with doing the job. Now, somebody just sang out. We looked at military, we looked at 130 loadmaster training profile and such, but in general, in the military, what do you guys got to do to get qualified as a loadmaster?
500 hours before we send them out to get their hands on stuff.
22
And then they qualify.
22 days of primary school and then off to the respective airframe.
Just 61 days.
And 61 days, yeah.
Then they get training at the units.
Yeah. Generally, it's what, about 3 to 4 months, maybe even longer with some initial operating
To a year, depending on
operating
the
experience.
And we still don't trust them.
And you're still not ready, are you?
About 3 years before you're up on by yourself.
Exactly. This guy got his training, he got 2 trips of IOE, which he was actually looked at by a Czech loadmaster, that's what they called him. And I said, what's a Czech loadmaster? You don't even, if the loadmaster is not even a real position, what's a Czech loadmaster not even a position? A couple IOE flights, initial operating experience by a Czech loadmaster who, oh, by the way, was evaluating him on bad information because the manuals he was evaluating him on were wrong. And that was it. And this kid was out flying a 747 on the deck trying to secure 207,000 pounds on that 747. Think he was ready? It was a 7. He was never given the tools to do the right job. Never. And it's a shame, too. The training is critical, as you guys know. Training is only the first part of you doing the job correctly. That's just the first gate. There are more gates, the experience level going through. Okay, so we wanted to look at how other operators used load masters. And generally what they did is they said, we look at this advisory circular. Advisory circular to the FAA is, here's how we suggest you do it, but you don't have to. You can either go with advisory circular and tailor your training program based on that, or you can tell the FAA to pound sand, and it doesn't really matter. This is just guidance. So there was some guidance material that came out of the old Fine Air. Where's my Fine Air, or where's my ADX good? Good, there you are, good. There's out of the Fine Air accident in Miami way back 1990-ish, 7? Okay, thanks. This advisory circular came out on how you should consider training these guys. But what we found was, as we talked to other airlines and other operators, it was inconsistent. They didn't necessarily comply with the advisory circular. Sometimes their training was all over the map. Sometimes some operators were training less than 68 hours. National Airlines was a little bit on the lower side, some trained a little bit more, but it was really inconsistent. No standardization. They had nothing really consistent as far as how the loadmaster is supposed to do their job. And here was the big one, and this is something that it's kind of a paradigm shift that the industry is going through right now. Old school loadmasters in the civilian world were kind of, these guys just, they didn't have duty times. They would be on airplanes for days at a time. I did a accident of a Indy 11 overrun in Pujan, China, and we got on the cargo deck and we looked in the back and it looked like there was an apartment back there. And these guys, the 2 mechanics and loadmaster had put together pallets and built this little apartment in the back, and they'd been living on it for over a week because they were just living on the airplane. And the crews would cycle in, fly Hong Kong, wherever, and they were just sitting in the back. There's no duty times, no rest requirements, nothing. This accident loadmaster had been on duty, continuous duty, for 21 hours. Now the pilots had been on duty for 21 hours, but remember, there were 2 captains and 2 first officers. They were able to cycle out and get some rest back in the supernumerary. There's a cargo, or there's a mark area there. So they could go back there. The loadmasters couldn't do that. In fact, most of the time the loadmasters were kind of doing the paperwork and getting ready for the next level. He had been on duty for 21 hours. So we just found there was a lot of inconsistency in the industry how they treated these guys. So one of the things we did at the NTSB is, okay, bad operator, you did wrong, this guy did wrong, it was pilot error, whatever. But we always come back to the oversight authority, which in this case is always the FAA. And we always ask the FAA, what did you do? What regulations do you have that could have prevented this? What oversight did you do to ensure that this didn't happen? Okay. Well, I already told you, the loadmaster position doesn't exist in federal regulations in the civilian world. So we have principal inspectors that are assigned to each operator by the FAA, and they're in charge of the oversight. And so when I asked all these inspectors, do you ever go out and look at your loadmasters on the certificate and see what they were doing? There's no guidance. Anybody watched how they loaded these loads? No, it's no guidance. Anybody know how to load in the FAA one of these special loads? No, there's really no guidance. Right? That's a big hole in the system. We found all the errors in National Airlines manuals. It was poorly written, and there was a lot of critical safety information that was out of there. And those FAA guys saw those manuals and missed it. They didn't even know those critical errors were missing. And then we just asked them, what do you know about special loads and how they should be tied down? You're the one that's responsible for going out and look at the operator, and guess what? They didn't have the training. They didn't know what they would be looking at, even if they had oversight of what we're doing. Then the next thing we did, and I asked them this, and this is pretty incredible too, you guys could understand this. One of the things the FAA is supposed to do is, on these airplanes in the civilian world, they're supposed to go out there and do what's called en route inspections. They're supposed to ride in the cockpit, ride in the back, watch the operation, real-time operation, to see how you're doing it. And if you're doing it right, those are called en route inspections. Right? This operator primarily flew these airplanes from Dubai and into theater, Afghanistan, or Kandahar on occasion, but Camp Ashton maybe. So these guys were only flying into a war zone all the time. So I asked the FAA, how many times did you ride on this airplane just to see if they were doing it right? They said, none. I said, why? The FAA said, well, we can't send inspectors into a war zone. It's dangerous. So how do you know they're doing it right? Oh, we don't. I said, well, okay, that's a required inspection that you're supposed to ride on that airplane, right? Yes, it is. So at the end of the year, when you say, you give yourself all your big star and say, I've done all my inspection items, you get to that one, you didn't complete it. What do? Oh, we defer it. We just put it on to next year. Oh, okay. How many years can you defer that? We just elevate the risk. Okay? But how many times can you defer a required inspection? And the answer is infinity. It just doesn't seem right. It seems like at some point in time, the FAA should stop and say, wait a minute, we need to put eyes on this. You, the taxpayers, are paying us to have oversight of these operations, but we're not doing our job. So let's stop the operation until we can see it and inspect it and make sure it's doing good. The FAA wasn't doing that because they could defer these items to infinity. So, what were some of the safety issues we saw during the course of this investigation? Well, obviously deficient procedures in how to secure the loads, not only from this operator, but mind you, we went to a lot of other operators and watched their operations. A couple of them got pretty big names out there, and they were all doing it wrong. So we see a very big deal on how people are actually securing these special loads. There was obviously inadequate guidance, and the big one is there's no certification process for the pilots or for the loadmasters to do this. Also, the oversight was bad, unclear FAA responsibility. There's an operations inspector with the FAA and a maintenance inspector. And when I asked both of them the same question, who has responsibility over the loadmaster? There's no guidance. They have nothing that says who's supposed to be looking at these guys and how they do these loads. They're not trained. And of course, the last one I just mentioned was the unlimited deferral of surveillance. Those are the primary safety issues we identified. So once we identified those, we developed our probable cause. And it wasn't the loadmaster did something wrong. I want you guys to really look at this. The probable cause was not that the loadmaster made an error, because everybody says NTSB does pilot error all the time and just walks away. No. It was the inadequate procedures that were provided to this loadmaster. He was not provided the tools necessary. And then obviously contributing at the end was the FAA just didn't have a good enough oversight on how to do these type of special cargo loads. So we came up with a bunch of recommendations, 6 to be exact. We told operators, you need to use FAA-approved data. You can't take the weight of a vehicle, divide it by the weight of a strap, and come up with the total number of straps. You can't use simplistic math to try and secure these monster loads. So we asked them to require approved data from the manufacturer. We also told them, you know what, FAA, you need to go out there and look at everybody's manuals now. We found it in this case. We found it in multiple other cases. Their manuals, these operators are using incorrect data in their manuals. Go look at everybody. And actually, to their credit, they're in the process of doing that. I think I got 6 down now or something like they've done 6 of the operators. They're doing a manual review, so that's good. Hey, FAA inspectors, you know, you need to get trained on how to do these loads too, so you know what you're looking for when you walk out to a 747 or NV11 or something like that. And if you're going to blow off en route inspections ad infinitum, just because they're going into a war theater, which, oh, by the way, you had no problem with 7 young civilians flying in 747 into it. That's just my editorial. You need to figure out how to mitigate that risk, that elevated risk. Figure out what you're going to do. You can't just defer these things forever. And then the last one was the big one, was the certification of a loadmaster. First off, you need to define it. You need to certify it in the civilian world, and you need to develop policies and procedures that govern their job, including duty time restrictions, rest requirements, certification standards, training standards, and what's included in that. And part of the process of this, something Doug's involved in right now too with the working group, they're trying to figure that out. It's not easy. But you know what? I wrote 4 of these recs, and I didn't consider writing them because it was going to be easy. But the days of operators operating with loadmasters living in pallets for a week in the back of NV11s as the old school have got to end. And you got to move them out one stone at a time. And the legacy of these 7 kids, and they were all young, the legacy to them is that maybe we can do something in the civilian world that gets down close to where you guys already are in the military world. Now, the last thing I do is I close with a question to each one of you. Why is this accident important?
It shows the world or the government that the problems out there, and that it was catastrophic accidents that brought it to light, but as I understand, it happens several times a year, not on that scale.
Sometimes on a smaller, sometimes on a larger scale. Sometimes the errors we see from this operator, we've saw even worse in other operators. So this is what you see in national is going on a lot in the civilian world. This is not an anomaly. This is something continually going on. But why is this important to you guys? Y'all are military and you're professional loadmasters. Why is it important to you? Totally. How?
From the first loadmaster training, restraint is in our basic blocks.
Right.
And we stress load shift. Any kind of cargo shift can take out a jet. That's why it's preventable. When our 18-year-olds go through, they learn restraint. They learn how to tie down, how it's going to affect your airplane because they make them do weight balances. So
If somebody had come up to you and shown you a broken strap and a shifted load, as a professional loadmaster, what would be the first thing you'd think? It's not down, yeah, it ain't tied down correctly, right?
Stop and look at it.
Exactly, and that's what but that's the saddest thing about this is we heard these guys, they had the clues based on the CVR, we heard them come up with this. It looked like there was a knot here. Well, what do you do? What happens when you tie, what's the strength criteria for a canvas strap that has a knot in it? Does it have a 5,000 pound allowance at that point in time? Of course not. But did this kid know? Did he know that these straps weren't going to be being able to react in the multiple ways and all these things? He didn't have an engineer to figure out.
You have the flight hours, how long, how much time do they have to run?
Which ones?
The
Loadmaster had several years with the company. He hadn't been there that long.
How many hours on the jet?
I'd have to look. I don't remember exactly. On the 747? I'm not sure.
Just flying, hands-on cargo.
Hands-on cargo?
Yeah, any airframe.
This company was the
Not
only
more.
time he'd had hands-on cargo in an aviation environment. And so he was relying only on the training from the in-house training he got from this company.
One of your recommendations, and you were saying they've already maybe gone to 6 companies and reviewed their publications for...
That's not us, that's the FAA.
Right,
Right.
but who in the FAA was reviewing? Because do they know what they're reviewing?
Yeah,
Do
actually-
they know what they're doing?
That's a good question. And the FAA created what's called a CFT, it's a cargo focus team. And this cargo focus team were subject matter experts, not just from the industry, but within the FAA. Some of these were very highly regarded engineers. So what the FAA was doing with this cargo focus team is, look, they finally got the right people in the room at the same time to start doing one job and focus on one job. And that's what they started doing, looking at these manuals and making sure and comparing them to the manufacturer manuals.
And I've worked with a lot of engineers over the years, and as great as they are, and as great information as they provide us, loadmasters, putting it into language that your loadmaster can understand in a publication, I mean, we're still fighting with that day-to-day right now in the military unit. So it's got to be somebody there that can translate engineer speak to loadmaster speak.
Well, this cargo focus team is actually doing the first step. They're taking a look at these manuals to begin with and make sure there aren't any gaps and that they're using the right manufacturer guidance and FAA approved documentations. Now, what you're talking about is the next step. Now, how do we simplify this to simplify the loadmaster's job to take that engineering data and use it in real time on the line? And some companies, I can't say which ones, but some companies are developing strapping plans, computerized strapping plans that they can actually develop into a PDF, send it into the field, and now the loadmaster can take a look on one of these. He gets a special load, like here, a free-floating load on the deck. He can look at the plan and say, this is where I need to put the straps. And not on a C track, but I need to put it on a rail. I need to put this one here. I need to put this one here. So they're trying to simplify that. That's the next process.
Would it be fair to say the pushback from the airlines is going to be pure cost? Because I mean, based on the numbers you're talking about, these rail plans, and these rails don't have the capacity for what any of the specialized cargoes are going to ask for, other than like Boeing said, one piece of cargo with 60 straps.
Right.
So I mean, how is
There's always going to be a cost thing. Airlines are always going to look at cost. Would they have not done this if they accepted this load, or done this flight if they were told you can only take one of these?
Probably not.
Probably.
Money enough.
Because it's only one. Now you're flying a 747 with all the gas you're going to burn for the 3 hours it's going to take you to Dubai with 7 crew members who are salaried, and all the costs and insurance and the flight hour cost for that one tank is going to be cost prohibitive. And the FAA also looks at cost, and they also look at whether there's enough risk associated with trying to develop a regulation. Regulations in the government are hard. I mean, like I said, the government, the FAA works at the warp speed of smell when it comes to trying to develop a regulation. So for them to actually develop a ARAC, which is an Aviation Rules Committee, and they're actually getting the working group input that Doug's working on, for them to do that is pretty damn big, because they don't like to do regulations, but they're moving in that direction in the civilian world. You had a question?
Yes, sir. Is there anything being done right now to revamp the loadmaster training as far as trying to create a loadmaster certification in the civilian world? Are they addressing that at all right now?
That's exactly. You want to address that?
Very well.
Yeah, I can. And one thing I want to, before we even get to your question, the difference between the FAA and NTSB. FAA, they make the rules, they're the regulators. NTSB is not associated with the FAA. It's like an Aussie, calling an Aussie a Brit or a Brit an Aussie.
Right.
They do oil and water. NTSB, they report directly to Congress.
Exactly.
So there is that segregation between the two. What I'm fortunate to do, I was selected last year by the FAA to be able to sit in on this Loadmaster working group. This is a group that we're taking the recommendations from the NTSB to create certification. Now, there's multiple recommendations. We only have the one to create certification for Loadmasters. Back to we were talking earlier, the term Loadmaster, it's so general. In the military, we know exactly what that is. A Loadmaster in the Navy or in the Air Force, it's a Loadmaster. Civilian side, it holds many terms. So that's our one challenge is we got to define what is a Loadmaster, what are those responsibilities. And then on top of that, this particular accident, you get into special cargo, which is even further advanced, rolling stock, stuff like that.
How are you looking at training?
I'm sorry?
How are you looking at training?
As a civilian Loadmaster, I worked for Evergreen Airlines 747s and then over to Atlas Air. So I've got some airline experience. The difference between this airline and this one can be day and night. I'm thankful that I had the training that I got in the military to teach me a lot of this other, technique and really makes you that much more well qualified.
So is the working group, are they actually doing anything about this training?
Yes and no. To become a certified Loadmaster, what does it take? Training is looked at as, okay, you have to have this amount of classroom and hands-on practical experience.
Why not just mimic that of the military weapons?
Say again?
Why wouldn't they just mimic like a 17 or C5 or
Money. Keep in mind, I was talking to some guys earlier, in the military, we all have budgets, but we're not as focused on those budgets as an airline. An airline makes money when that airplane's flying. When that airplane's on the ground, they're not making money. Airlines report to their board of directors. It's all about the profit.
Now, if we get this, had some conversation a little while ago, and something that I hadn't thought about that we may work on with this working group, is that if we can prove or align the training and it looks like military training, you can't take military training in a commercial world because it's not going to work. But if you have this training that's developed in some way, shape, or form, and then you take a military guy and say, well, yep, you've got this, just like the pilots do. The pilots, they don't have to go through all their training over again. Even if it doesn't align with the Part 61 training, they can say, okay, you've got so much training, it looks kind of like this. Okay, we will accept that, and then they don't have to go through a training. So the certification, when it becomes whatever it might look like, or even the training, if it's not certified, if there's a specific type of training that you have to go through, that Loadmaster training is going to look pretty dang similar to that. And that's where it's going to help our Professional Loadmaster Association, and it's going to have a crossroad for the Loadmasters so that we can say, okay, the Loadmasters that got this amount of training have this training in there, and the cross is going to be a whole lot easier.
In the civilian world, you could have a Loadmaster working at Company X and they're always doing ULDs. They're not going to get the experience moving vehicles or helicopters. Where somebody out of the military, I mean, we move rolling stock all the time, almost weekly, you could say. So, as the PLA, what we want to do is, one, educate the industry. That's what we're all about. We want to promote the Loadmasters. Coming from the military, if somebody just does 4 years or if they do 24 years, that training that you have, that is a valuable asset. That is a tool. You can go out and market that to the airlines and say, look, I was a C-130 guy and a C-17 guy. I've got special cargo experience. Where if you've got somebody coming out of the civilian side, they're not going to have that. The other aspect of what we want to do is, when we educate the industry is what kind of levels or standards do you need to train somebody to? What Captain Lawrence had up here, yeah, they've got hazmat training, but again, the key items were missing. The principles of restraint, shoring, a lot of that stuff is missing, where we need to take from the PLA and get that incorporated into the industry. Let me go up here real quick.
Eric, I understand a little bit then, so you sitting on the board up there, listening in on this, each of us, speaking to the majority of us, we're kind of no nonsense and we'll be like, well, yeah, half this stuff is absolutely dumb, we know that. But when you go up there, they don't want to listen to anything you have to say if you start mentioning the term military this way, or it's going to be a military guy, this is the way it's been done, or training existence, or can we just piggyback off that, because they want to just shut down as soon as they start doing anything about this is the way it's done.
It's tough because there's a big difference between the military and the civilian. Again, budget has a lot to do with it. Safety's, it should always come first, always.
Even if they're carrying the same stuff.
Sorry?
They said even if they're carrying the same stuff,
Right. What we,
I'm just gonna say on the congressional side, I know there's been some lawsuits I was reading about recently with some of the family members.
That's civil action, has nothing to do with us.
Understand that, but because of that, I know often on other issues, that gets Congress maybe involved saying, we need to, and I'm not a big fan of too much government, but it's to get them into saying, we need to get things a little safer out there. And have you heard of anything from the congressional side maybe about any interest in this based on your report?
I don't think, most of it has been internal to the industry. NACA, which is the National Air Cargo Association, so we were part of a lot of their initial meetings after the accident. We were kind of fly on the wall watching what they were doing. They were very interested. So you have a lot of industry groups that are in the process of, we need to do some changes. But keep in mind, to get the FAA to actually develop a rules-making committee and a working group in the first place to look at the certification is encouraging, okay? Because they don't do that. So you don't need Congress on your back right now. They're in the process. And if Congress said, "What are you doing?" And I'll say, "Well, we got to work. We're looking at it, we're developing it." How fast they do it is one thing.
So I was just gonna say the problem of training loadmasters on multiple different airframes and having some type of basic certification has already been looked at and solved by the military. We've got a course called the Loadmaster course. We all go through it